It was hard for Machiavelli to keep a straight face at the mention of humanism. In 1520, the possibility arose of a public commission to write a humanist history of Florence, following the example of Bruni and Poggio. He needed to compose a test piece, a modello di storia. The topic he chose was the life of the early 14th century Lucchese signore, Castruccio Castracani. Humanist historiography was subject to literary and rhetorical conventions, and Machiavelli filled his text to overflowing with appropriate material. Speeches by a leader before engagements and on his deathbed, exaggerated numbers of enemy slain in battle, the protagonist's remarkable birth and adolescence. In the genre of humanist historiography, truth, derived from the norms of rhetoric, meant not absolute adherence to fact, but rather probability or verisimilitude. Like an advocate in court, a humanist historian's job was to create the semblance of fact, not to follow the sources scrupulously. The bare bones of Castruccio's biography lacked the elements constituting the life of a classical hero as narrated by Sallust or Plutarch. And so Machiavelli took it upon himself to fashion a plausible modern recreation of an ancient warrior monarch's life. The result was a piece of romantic fantasy, only occasionally coinciding with historical fact. He invited in an imaginary tale of Castruccio's retrieval as a foundling by the Castracani and then adoption by the Guinigi families. Castruccio was actually the legitimate scion of the Antelminelli, a family of Lucchese magnates. He denied Castruccio his real wife and 9 children, declaring he had remained unmarried and had named as his heir a fictitious member of the Guinigi family, who then proceeded to found a Lucchese regime that lasted until the death of the historical Paolo Guinigi in 1430. The fact that there was no Guinigi lordship in Lucca before 1400 crowned the jest. Machiavelli let his readers in on the joke. An invented character was given the name of a landlord recently recommended to him by one of his friends who was vetting the piece. Machiavelli would not have been Machiavelli if he had taken all this hokum from humanist historiography seriously. The biography of Castruccio offered an unmissable opportunity to send up humanism. Even at the lowest point in his fortunes, Machiavelli could not resist poking fun at humanism. Languishing in a prison cell after his arrest in February 1513, he directed a poem to his old friend Giuliano de' Medici. Instead of providing help, wrote Machiavelli, a muse struck him on the face and shut his mouth, saying, "You sit here chained like a madman. You are not Niccolò, but Dazzo." Andrea Dazzi was a long-serving humanist professor at the Studio Fiorentino, noted for his erudite Latin verse. For Machiavelli, only a humanist pedant deserved the treatment, the imprisonment that he was then enduring, and torture indeed. A few months later, Machiavelli could not stop himself from mocking the humanist pretensions of his friend and would-be patron Francesco Vettori. Complaining of an ambassador's tedious life at the Roman Curia, where I speak 20 words with Pope Leo X, 10 with Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, 6 with the magnificent Giuliano de' Medici, Vettori had boasted of the consolation he was able to find at home, where I have arranged to get quite a few histories, especially Roman ones. Livy with the epitome of Lucius Florus, Sallust, Plutarch, Appianus Alexandrinus, Cornelius Tacitus, Suetonius, Lampridius, and Spartianus, and others who write about the emperors, Herodian, Ammianus Marcellinus, and Procopius. And with them I pass the time. For Machiavelli, such insensitivity was insufferable, considering his own unemployment, poverty, and isolation in the country, where he was reduced to consorting not with the highest-ranking curial dignitaries, but with woodcutters, carters, innkeepers, butchers, millers, and kiln workers. So he replied famously, outdoing the Tory's pomposity. In the evening I go back home and enter my study. I strip off the muddy, sweaty clothes of every day and put on the robes of court and palace. And in this graver dress I enter the antique courts of the ancients. They welcome me, and there I taste the food that is mine alone and for which I was born. I make bold to speak and ask them to explain the motives behind their undertakings. And they in their humanity reply. And for the space of 4 hours I forget the world and all its vexations. I no longer fear poverty. I tremble no more at death. I am wholly absorbed in the ancients. Machiavelli's father, Bernardo, was a juridical pundit who never practiced law. Instead, he occupied himself as a legal antiquary, researching obscure points of Roman law, and as a book dealer and collector, not only of legal tomes, but also of classical and humanist texts. Cicero's De Officiis, Philippics and De Oratore, Rhetorica ad Herennium, Aristotle's Ethics, together with Donato Acciaiuoli's commentary, Ptolemy's Geographia, Justinus, Priscian, and Biondo's Italia Illustrata in Decades. He undertook to compile an index of Livy in exchange for a copy of the text. He borrowed a copy of Ptolemy for almost the entire duration of this work. His index of Livy place names and geographical terminology was part of a larger project of avant-garde geographical research based on classical sources. Again, his son Niccolò could not resist poking fun at his father's humanist predilections. One of his earliest compositions, written before he began to earn a comfortable salary as second chancellor in 1498, and before his father's death in 1500, was a poem sent to Bernardo, whom he teases for caring more about his books than about eating. My Messer Bernardo, you will buy ducks and geese and you won't eat them. Bernardo Machiavelli had not been so preoccupied by his books as to neglect his son's education, choosing a series of competent and even distinguished teachers. Matteo da Rocca San Casciano, Niccolo's first recorded instructor, was Florence's official grammar school master for 16 years. Battista da Poppi, Niccolo's second teacher, was a book collector, lending Bernardo a copy of Pliny's Natural History at about the time he was teaching Niccolò. Benedetto Riccardini, known as Philologus, was a pupil of Feliciano's who would teach grammar at the school of San Lorenzo in Florence for 10 years. Riccardini worked as an editor for the Florentine publisher Filippo Giunti too, preparing numerous Greek and Latin texts for the press. He dedicated an intermediate grammar, Erudimenta Grammatices Latinae Linguae, to Niccolò, our Niccolò, and his cousin Alessandro Machiavelli, whom he taught as a pair, probably between 1477 and 1480. Paolo Sassi da Ronciglione, Niccolo's last known Latin master, held a communal teaching post, also serving as grammar teacher in the church schools at San Lorenzo and the Florentine Cathedral. He was the Latin master of humanists, including Pietro Crinito and Michele Verino. Bernardo Machiavelli thus prepared the ground for his son's higher education. There is no explicit evidence for Niccolò's further humanist study at university. The biographer and historian Paolo Giovio suggested that Machiavelli attended the lectures of Marcello Virgilio Adriani, successor at the University of Florence to the great philologist Angelo Poliziano. Machiavelli admitted to us, wrote Giovio, that he infused his writings with the refinements, flores, of the Greek and Latin languages that he got from Marcello Virgilio Adriani, whose notary and disciple in public office he was. Some have disputed the obvious meaning here, but other passages in Giovio's writings, as well as Machiavelli's particular work with the text of Lucretius and Terence support Jovio's statement. Positive evidence of Machiavelli's humanist education comes from his early scholarly activities and first writings. His work as a copyist extended to Terence's Eunuch, a standard school text in the Renaissance. Including a simple marginal grammatical explication, his activities with this text at first sight do not appear to go beyond the basic commentary characteristic of a grammar school reader. Nevertheless, his version offered a number of readings outside the usual variants employed to establish the text, and so might indicate a more sophisticated approach. As a copyist, Machiavelli's engagement with Lucretius went further. Not only did he incorporate the erudite corrections apparently proposed by Adriani, but when the manuscript source offering these emendations ceased near the end of the poem's first book, Machiavelli launched in a new direction, including readings that would soon appear in two cutting-edge versions of the text. Whether this activity represented Machiavelli's own interventions, or more probably derived from further original study of the text by the likes of Adriani, the upshot is that Machiavelli was associated with efforts to produce a version of Lucretius more critical than the feeble efforts emanating from various printers before the mid-1490s. His early engagement with Lucretius has been now shown by Alison Brown to extend to autograph marginal comments to the text, especially to Book 2. A number of these marginalia are narrowly philological, dealing with alternative readings or supplying omitted verses, but some treat Lucretius's argument. Largely paraphrased or simple explication, they are standard university students' fare. Further evidence of Machiavelli's humanist interest in the 1490s has emerged from his activities as a translator. Until recently, it had been believed, on the basis of an orthographical analysis first published in 1912 of the autograph manuscript, that the first version of Machiavelli's translation of Terence's comedy, Andria, dated from 1517 or early 1518. However, a recent study has shown that the spellings in this first version of Andria do not correspond to Machiavelli's orthography in any of the surviving dated autographs, that is, from 1498 to 1527. The consequent hypothesis that the first version of Andria actually dates from before 1498 is confirmed by the crude and clumsy language of the translation, not consistent with the mature writer that Machiavelli had become by 1517. In this first version, Machiavelli dismisses Savonarola sarcastically, whereas by 1517 he had become a weighty figure in Machiavelli's political thought. A further point is Machiavelli's reliance on commentaries in preference to the text itself in preparing the translation, an immature approach characteristic of medieval and Renaissance schools, whereas in his maturity, for example, with Livy in the Discourses or with Ava in the long poem the Serenata, he followed original versions of the classical text, not commentary tradition. If Machiavelli's first version does date from the years before 1498, then the translation of Andria offers a window onto Machiavelli's humanist culture before entering the Chancery. Machiavelli's work with Andria can be connected with his own Latin grammar studies. His teacher, Benedetto Riccardini, brought out an edition of Terence in 1505, intended to aid adolescent readers. And one can imagine that Terence had formed part of Machiavelli's own curriculum under Riccardini. Terence was also held up as a stylistic model in the school operated by Machiavelli's second grammar teacher, Paolo Sassi. Indeed, Terence had become a standard author in 15th century Italian grammar schools. Andria had been the subject of lectures at the University of Florence by Riccardini's own teacher, Poliziano, who also taught Adriani. Translation from Latin to the vernacular never played a role in formal Latin study at school or university level during the Renaissance. but it was an activity associated with learned humanist circles. In the mid-1490s, the likely date of Machiavelli's own translation of Andria, the mid-1490s, witnessed a flowering of vernacular translations of Plautus and Terence at Ferrara. In Florence itself, Andria had been staged in 1476 by pupils of the prominent grammar teacher Giorgio Antonio Vespucci in his school premises, in the Medici Palace, and in the Palazzo della Signoria. So it is hard not to see Machiavelli's translation of Andria as part of the current humanist scene. Machiavelli's version of Andria is by and large a literal translation of the text, remote from the loose and often fanciful translations of the classics made by medieval Italian writers. Machiavelli is at times so literal as to distort the meaning of the text and to produce nonsense. His dependence on the commentary tradition places him in the mainstream of classical studies in Renaissance schools and universities. Given his ironic critique of humanist pedantry, as we've seen, it is easy to understand how Machiavelli's humanist background has been denied. He was a uniquely original writer who would move beyond the limits of contemporary humanist learning. There has been a tendency, albeit illogical, to assume that he must therefore have been an autodidact, educated outside the conventional humanist pattern. This kind of interpretation began to take shape soon after Machiavelli's own lifetime, when succeeding generations started to realize and take exception to his unconventionality, which was attributed to his lack of formal learning. Benedetto Varchi dismissed his Latinity, while Jean Baudin turned such testimony into an argument that, with better knowledge of ancient philosophers and historians, Machiavelli's thinking would have been more sound, i.e. more conventional. Machiavelli's working methods fell far short of the philological standards upheld by some contemporaries. As Scipione Ammirato wrote of Machiavelli's Florentine histories, he mistakes the years, changes the dates, alters the facts, confounds the causes, expands, adds, detracts, diminishes, and does anything that his whim fancies, perhaps to make his writing more refined and less dry than if he had kept to the chronology and the facts, as if the subject matter had to accommodate the style and not the style the subject matter. But humanism did not mean only or even principally philology. Machiavelli's approach derived from rhetoric. There was no humanist historian who regularly checked his sources one against another, nor indeed who refrained from exaggerating or even inventing evidence in the attempt to sustain a point of view. This was the intellectual world in which Machiavelli was nurtured. He knew what he wanted to argue and then looked for, and one has to admit, not infrequently manufactured, evidence to support his views. His lack of philological rigor does not negate his humanism. Machiavelli's university experience is related to two traditions through which humanism was assimilated into the Italian universities. He belonged to a wider elite family, although his particular branch had fallen from aristocratic status. So his attendance at Adriani's lectures in the studio during the 1490s resembles the experience of elite Florentines such as Francesco Guicciardini, who attended Adriani's lectures at the University of Florence too. Such activity continued traditions established earlier in the 15th century, whereby young men from elite Florentine families followed the lectures of prominent humanists in their native city, not in order to gain professional qualifications, but rather as a part of their wider general education. Machiavelli's experience at university also links him to other chancery figures who benefited from teaching at the University of Florence, including the first chancellor, Bartolomeo Scala, who was taught there by Carlo Marzupini, and Cristoforo Landino, a Florentine chancery secretary, as well as a university professor, who was a Marzupini pupil too. The closest parallel is between Machiavelli and his own professor, Adriani, who was taught by Poliziano, just as Machiavelli was Adriani's pupil. Both had significant careers in the Florentine chancery. Adriani as first chancellor, Machiavelli as second chancellor, secretary to the Dieci di Balia and to the Nove di Milizia. So Machiavelli's humanism had roots in his university experience. Machiavelli ridiculed humanism, not from the outside, but as an indubitable insider. Machiavelli's father, Bernardo, had originally aimed to follow in the footsteps of prominent Machiavelli lawyers and establish a legal practice in Florence. But such hopes were dashed by the rebellion against the Medici regime in 1458 of his cousin, the leading lawyer and politician Girolamo Machiavelli. Bernardo was connected to the rebels not only through his own family, but also through the family of his wife's first husband, the Benizzi. Bernardo's reaction was to cut himself off from Florentine civic and political life. He had no business activities or investments and never held political office. Bernardo's political and civic quietism was followed initially by his son Niccolò. Florence was a city of work, but despite his household's straitened circumstances, Niccolò was involved in no professional or business activity for the first 29 years of his life. All this changed with his unexpected election as second chancellor in June 1498. In the first half of his life, spent in the wilderness outside the civic world of Renaissance Florence, Machiavelli had amassed huge pent-up energy. The enormous vigor with which he threw himself into chancery work demonstrated a remarkable rejection of his immediate family's way of life. The break with Bernardo's heritage extended to literature. What is particularly striking for a Florentine is Bernardo's almost complete indifference to the vernacular. Tuscany and Florence were the great hubs of Italian language and literature in the later Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Other educated and not so educated Florentines from the middle and upper classes had book collections dominated by vernacular literature. Bernardo Machiavelli, in contrast, showed an interest in only one vernacular work, an Italian translation of Pliny's Natural History, which he borrowed for a month in 1478. For Bernardo Machiavelli, books and reading meant Latin. Niccolò had already begun to move in a contrary direction before joining the chancery in 1498, composing a series of popular-styled vernacular poems. In his verses to his father mentioned earlier, he entered into the Florentine tradition of burlesque poetry, typified by Burchiello, who had also made abundant use of extravagant vocabulary, enigmatic allusions, idiomatic expressions, and linguistic inventions. In the Capitolo Pastorale, the Canzone, the two Strambotti, and the sonnet, Se senza a voi pensar solo un momento, in fact, Machiavelli's only sonnet, all datable to the period of Machiavelli's Medician prehistory, to adopt a felicitous label coined, but then, unfortunately, and in my view erroneously, rejected by Mario Martelli. There are echoes of Francesco Cei, Antonio Pucci, Antonio Bonciani, and particularly of Luigi Pulci's Morgante, not to mention Petrarch, Poliziano, and Lorenzo the Magnificent himself. Machiavelli's preoccupation with the vernacular continued in his chancery years, when his literary production consisted of a lengthy Italian historical poem, the Primo Decennale of 1504, and three long capitoli, or sets of tercets, Di Fortuna, dell'Ingratitudine e dell'Ambizione, written respectively in 1506, 1507, and the end of 1509. The poetic narrative of the Primo Decennale and of the three capitoli represented a return to an earlier civic and communal style of verse in vogue during the 14th and early 15th centuries. These early literary efforts had nothing to do with humanism. The youthful short poems were in non-classicized literary forms, while his longer chancery poetry mainly belonged to the genre of capitolo morale, a non-classicizing type of moral and political verse popular in Florence before the Laurentian period. Similarly non-classical and popular were three carnival songs, datable to the Chancery years. Machiavelli's first extended literary prose composition was The Prince. The Prince is not a true humanist work. This is not because it is written in Italian, given that a great many humanists have been writing prose works in Italian for generations. The Prince is a treatise in the genre of moral political writings, divided into short numbered chapters with Latin titles. There is no ancient precedent for such a format. The model here was the medieval scholastic Mirror of Princes, such as Giles of Rome's bestseller, De Regimine Principum. The most significant role of the ancients and the humanists in The Prince was to reject their heritage. Machiavelli challenged the idealism of Plato in chapter 15 and overturned Cicero's moral philosophy as transmitted via De Officiis and via humanists such as Platina or Pontano in their treatment of the virtues. In The Prince, Machiavelli gives the impression of an erstwhile student of the classics and humanism seeking to move beyond that heritage. His suspicion of humanism is symbolized by the comparison of himself in the letter to Vittori of 10 December 1513 to the character Geta, who in the Tuscan tale, dating from the early 15th century, comes to grief despite his 7 years of classical studies in Athens. A clear indication of Machiavelli's rejection of humanism in The Prince is the preface, where he explicitly disavows the Ciceronian rhetorical style favored by the humanists. I haven't embellished this work or stuffed it with grandiloquent clauses or pompous and striking words, or with any of the other stirring and superficial features that people use to describe and embellish their material, an apt characterization of The Prince's non-classicizing telegraphic style. When Machiavelli rededicated The Prince to the younger Lorenzo de' Medici in autumn or early winter of 1515-1516, he wrote, "None of my possessions is as dear to me as the knowledge of the exploits of great men that I have gleaned from long experience of modern affairs and constant reading about ancient history." This implies that The Prince is rooted in humanist study, but here he was speaking with a new voice and from a new perspective from when he actually wrote the text. In 1515, Machiavelli began to frequent the Florentine Gardens owned by Cosimo Rucellai. Here a circle of aristocrats and litterateurs met to discuss not only the beauty of the location, but also their neoclassicizing endeavors. Much of the activity associated with the circle at the Rucellai Gardens was literary. Neoclassical tragedies and comedies were composed. The status of the Italian language was considered. The quarrel of the ancients and moderns was debated. Members of the circle were key figures in the revival of classical poetic genre in the Italian language. Machiavelli's own contribution at the Rucellai Gardens was the discourses on the first decade of Titus Livy. As his younger friend Filippo de' Nervi wrote, "During the lifetime of Cosimo Rucellai, who died very young, having shown great promise in Latin, a group of young Latinists of high intellect had met for a considerable time in the Rucellai Gardens, and Niccolò Machiavelli was constantly among them. And I was a great friend of Niccolò, and of all of them, and very often conversed with them. They exercised themselves a great deal through the medium of Latin, with lectures on histories, and on these histories, at the instigation of his companions, Machiavelli composed his book of discourses on Livy." Machiavelli's perspective on antiquity in the discourses has moved on significantly since The Prince. In The Prince, his call for the revival of Italy involved the imitation of key exemplary figures such as Cesare Borgia, from whose actions he had himself, based on his own practical experience, claimed to derive the lessons suitable for a new prince. I don't know what better precepts I could give a new prince than the exploits of Cesare Borgia. Machiavelli's formula involved the use of exemplary figures, plus his own precepts, derived primarily from his diplomatic and military experience, plus the right occasion, which is the present moment. The scheme in The Prince hardly involved the lessons of Roman history. In the discourses, the precepts derived from Roman history are now paramount. Machiavelli's own role is to act as historian-teacher, bringing to light these self-evident truths from the past. So many of the rules observed by Rome, he wrote, in relation to internal as well as external affairs, are not only not imitated nowadays, but are scorned, some being judged untrue, some impossible to imitate, some irrelevant and useless. The result is that, in our ignorance, we are prey to whoever has wanted to overrun this country. There has been a shift from his previous posture as the voice of experience in the prince to a new role in the discourses as historian, teaching the time-honored function of exercising the time-honored function of teaching the lessons of history. Fortune is still powerful, but the way forward is not just to seize the right occasion, as in the prince, but to become a lover of antiquity, whose lessons will enable Italy's savior to arise. Because fortune is fickle, he also wrote in the discourses, republics and regimes fluctuate in prosperity. They will always do so until someone comes along who is so passionate about antiquity that he will constrain fortune in such a way that it will no longer want to show with every rotation of the sun how great its power is. Antiquity, not just the Prince Savior or Redeemer, has now become, for Machiavelli, the key to Italy's salvation. The discourses belong to a long-established genre of classical and humanist study, the commentary on an ancient author, a basic literary form in antiquity itself, subsequently taken up by numerous humanists. It was Machiavelli's assimilation into the Rucellai Gardens circle that brought him back to the classics and to humanism. Members of the group were attempting to classicize Italian literature, and Machiavelli adopted an analogous program in the discourses, the classicizing of politics. Now Machiavelli's main literary activities were in other neoclassical genre or based closely on classical sources. Mandragola, aptly described as the most purely Neo-Terentian vernacular comedy of the Italian Renaissance. The Art of War, a quintessential Neo-Ciceronian dialogue. Serenata, a poem of 264 verses, elaborating the story within a story from Book 14 of Ovid's Metamorphoses with a third narrative, and so creating a yet more complex artifice. Dell'Occasione, 22 verses concentrating a diffuse epigram by Ausonius. And above all, the Florentine Histories, the earliest significant effort to write a neoclassical humanist history modeled on Livy, Sallust, Bruni, and Poggio in the Italian vernacular. But in the end, Machiavelli's reconciliation with humanism went further than form. In his late works, and I mean the works written in the 1520s, he adopted the humanist Ciceronian moral and political values so blatantly rejected in The Prince, the Discourses, the Mandragola, and the Ass, all of which date from before 1520. Mandragola is the blackest of black comedies. It is a play without hero or heroine. Callimaco offers thanks to God for the wicked deeds of the priest to be done at his behest, wondering how he has merited such recompense from God. He admires his servant Ciro because he is a true villain. After his adultery, he declares sacrilegiously, "I should be more blessed than the blessed, more saintly than the saints." Unlike her Roman namesake, Lucrezia is happy to live on in adultery, awaiting her death, the death of her idiotic husband, purified by a defiled clergyman in a corrupt church. The world of Mandragola is a microcosm of the prince's political world, lacking in values or ideals, dominated by primitive instincts, lust, avarice, pride, procreation. In Mandragola, there is nothing but evil. In his other Neo-Terentian comedy, Clizia, Machiavelli's last major literary work, dating to the beginning of 1525, the drama assumes, by contrast, a moral purpose, unlike Mandragola, where vice is triumphant. As Machiavelli declares in Clizia's prologue, comedies were invented for the good of the spectators. Nicomaco's humiliation teaches the consequences of immorality. His vice is suitably punished, the plot being resolved in a return to the moral and social order. The comic purpose of Mandragola is ridicule. In Clizia, it is to teach good morals. The Prince is an egotistical text in which the new prince's selfish interests are paramount, with little room left for the greater political good. With a focus on the prince's own glory, it is no accident that Machiavelli hardly speaks of the public or common good in the work. The effects of his rule on his subjects are relevant only insofar as they support his regime. In The Prince, Machiavelli never uses the term politico, a word normally employed in the period to describe a good or unselfish political order, in the sense of the public good, vivere politico, or someone dedicated to the public good, uomo politico. Even his praise of Cesare Borgia's good government in the Romagna is ultimately about Borgia himself. Cesare Borgia was said to be cruel, but his cruelty put the Romagna in order, brought it unity, and restored peace and obedience. Here, the climax of the sentence is on the last word, obedience. The stress is on securing the prince's power. The benefits to the subjects are a means to an end. Wrongdoing, he wrote, should not be persisted in, but as far as possible turn to the good of one's subjects. Those who use this method can find some means of consolidating their position. Again, the emphasis is on the end of this, which is consolidating the position of the prince. The new prince needs to act in such a way that he will be able to set men's minds at rest and win them over to him when he confers benefits. The Prince Redeemer acts first to win honor and glory for himself, and only secondarily to benefit the Italian people. By marginalizing the common good in the prince, Machiavelli's language approaches traditional descriptions of tyranny, without, of course, ever explicitly using the word, which would have been insulting to its dedicatees. As Giles of Rome had written, the king is concerned with the common good, the tyrant with his own good, a view reiterated in about 1430 by Poggio. The king thinks of the advantage of those whom he rules, while the tyrant is intent on his own advantage. In contrast, the traditional values of the Italian city republics take center stage in The Art of War, in the discourse on Florentine affairs after the death of the younger Lorenzo de' Medici, and most notably in the Florentine histories. The common good, marginalizing the prince, now becomes central to Machiavelli's discussion. After the defeat of the Ghibellines in 1266, the victorious Popolo decided to reunite the city for the benefit of those who loved the good of the Republic. In 1304, the city rallied to repel the Ghibelline exile. So much higher was common utility regarded than private friendship. At the time of the Ciompi revolt in 1378, the honesty of Michele di Lando, their leader, was such that it never entered his head to do anything but what was for the good of all. Writing of Florence in the mid-15th century, Machiavelli declared that citizens gain reputation in cities in two ways, either through public or private means. The former is useful when it is not mixed with factions, because it is based on the common good, not on private advantage. In the discourses, Machiavelli had made the novel suggestion unprecedented suggestion, that civic divisions had been the foundations of Rome's liberty. But in the Florentine histories, he returned to the more traditional theme of Republican and Humanist political thought, arguing that unity was beneficial and dissension detrimental. If any lesson is useful to citizens who govern republics, it is that which demonstrates the reason for the hatreds and divisions of the city, so that they can keep themselves united. In 1378, Luigi Guicciardini was reported to have spoken in favor of unity. To what will your dissensions bring this your city? Do you not recall that, when it was disunited, Castruccio, a vile Lucchese citizen, defeated it. A Duke of Athens, your private condottiere, subjugated it. But when it was united, was it not able to overcome an Archbishop of Milan and a Pope, who after so many years of war were reduced to infamy? Machiavelli himself points to that regime, which ruled from 1381 to 1434 and conducted so many wars with such glory and added to its empire Arezzo, Pisa, Cortona, Livorno, and Montepulciano. And this regime would have gone on to greater things, writes Machiavelli, had the city remained united. Particularly acute is Machiavelli's condemnation of faction, another traditional theme of communal and humanist political thought. He tells Clement VII that their native city has always been divided, until, he adds flatteringly, the advent of the Medici. Your native city, having ceased to obey the emperors as a result of its dissensions, remained divided until it came to be governed under the auspices of your family. It needs to be underlined how much damage is caused to a republic or kingdom through changing its prince or government, not as a result of any external force, but solely through civil discord. Here one can see how minimal changes can bring republics and kingdoms, however powerful, to ruin. Frederick II sowed such discourse as to bring about the ruin of all Italy. Machiavelli points to the differences between divisions in Rome and in Florence. In the former, because dissensions were directed to the public good and to the preservation of liberty, they were beneficial, that is Rome. In the latter, Florence, they were always harmful, accompanied as they were by factions and partisans that had only their own interests in mind. Machiavelli now reverses the political morality that had made the Prince such a controversial work. The Duke of Athens is condemned for wanting to be feared rather than loved, unlike what was recommended in chapter 17 of The Prince. In place of his advice in chapter 5 of The Prince, where he argued that the best way to control formerly free subject towns was to wipe them out, he now praises Florence's lenient policy toward towns lost after the fall of the Duke, with the result that Florence rapidly gained their obedience. The infamous admonition in The Prince and in the discourses regarding the necessity of bad faith is reversed in the speech of the anonymous good citizen in 1372. When religion and the fear of God have been universally extinguished, an oath or one's word lasts only as long as it is useful. Men have recourse to these not to keep them, but because they enable them to deceive more easily. The morality of the Prince is the morality of the criminal leaders of the rebels in 1378, so that by condemning this leader's recommendations, Machiavelli reverses the Prince's morality. Now, this is the leader of the Ciompi speaking. You will see that all those who achieve great wealth and power have not got there by force or by fraud. Those who avoid such ways through folly or lack of foresight inevitably end up in servitude or in poverty. For faithful servants are always servants, and good men are always poor. Only the deceitful and the bold, the rapacious and the fraudulent escape servitude and poverty. When necessity presses, audacity is known as prudence. The opportunity that occasion brings you is fleeting. When it has escaped, one seeks in vain to seize it again. So all the things that he emphasized in The Prince: fraud, force, keeping one's promises, keeping good faith, deception, necessity, audacity, seize the opportunity. These are all recommended by form the basis of the recommendations of the leader of the Ciompi. Machiavelli significantly then proceeds to condemn such remarks. These arguments strongly inflamed spirits already feverish with evil. This is Machiavelli speaking about this speech. In chapter 15 of The Prince, Machiavelli had famously warned that anyone who wants entirely to play the part of a good man is bound to come to ruin among so many who are not good. But in the Florentine histories, Benedetto Alberti comes to grief because he is too good among so many who are bad. The moral norm of the Prince has now been reversed. Alberti being spotlighted as a paragon of virtue. You see how fortune has ruined me. It always happens thus to those who want to be good among so many wicked men. In The Prince, Machiavelli had championed the political cloak, or to use the contemporary cliche, spin doctoring. Naked power had to be wrapped in the trappings of piety and probity. In that work, The Prince, as well as in the discourses, he regarded morality, like religion, as a cloak to be exploited to promote or vindicate the ruler or the state. Morality and religion were key tools that regularly had to be subverted for selfish ends. He had rejected conventional morality not only as idealistic but as dangerous. The only place left for traditional ethics was as an artifice, or in his word, a cloak to protect and disguise the necessarily unscrupulous prince. The contemporary individual best demonstrating the merits of the cloak for Machiavelli was Ferdinand of Aragon, who, in The Prince, writes Machiavelli, who never preaches anything except peace and good faith. Making use of religion, he turned his hand to a pious work of cruelty when he chased out the Moriscos in 1502 and rid his kingdom of them. There could not have been a more pitiful or striking enterprise. Under the same cloak of religion, he assaulted Africa. In the Florentine histories, on the other hand, in contrast, Lorenzo de' Medici, speaking in the wake of the Pazzi conspiracy, disparages the political cloak. The powerful always cover the injuries they inflict with a cloak less dishonorable in appearance. In The Prince, Machiavelli had praised Francesco Sforza as a model new prince. Francesco, using appropriate means and by his own great virtue, from being a private citizen became Duke of Milan. What he won only after endless struggles he then held with little effort. In the Florentine histories, by contrast, Francesco Sforza is vilified as a tyrant in the speech made by the Milanese citizens whom he has betrayed. We know your cruelty, ambition, and arrogance. Oh, those unhappy cities forced to defend their liberty against the ambition of him who wishes to oppress them. We cannot be accused of any other fault except that we placed our trust where we should not have trusted at all. Your past life, your overweening ambition, never satisfied with any rank or position, should have warned us. We should have placed our hopes in someone who betrayed. We should not have placed our hopes in someone who betrayed the Lord of Lucca, held the Florentines and the Venetians to ransom, showed scant regard for the Duke of Milan, despised the King of Naples, and above all inflicted countless injuries on God and the Church. Above all, Francesco Sforza is condemned by the Milanese speakers for the deceit and bad faith that Machiavelli had recommended so outrageously in The Prince, chapter 17. Prince chapter 18, We should not have imagined that such great princes would have less influence than the Milanese over the heart of Francesco Sforza, and that he would feel obliged to keep with us the faith that he had so many times broken with others. The mode of dissemination and publication of Machiavelli's writings had a significant effect on his moral and political perspective. Only 3 of his works were printed in his lifetime: the Primo Decennale, Mandragola, and the Art of War. And of these, only the last involved his personal cooperation, the Art of War. Machiavelli's most radical writings, The Prince, the Discourses, The Ass, Mandragola, were conceived for and circulated within a salon culture. As Machiavelli moved from the more intimate and limited domain of manuscript publication, entering the more public sphere with The Art of War, the Florentine Histories, a widely known public commission, and Clizia, composed on demand from a now nationally renowned playwright, he became increasingly self-conscious, moderating his more radical tendencies to take account of the sensibilities of a wider public. Machiavelli was not immune to the normal human tendency to set aside youthful radicalism with the onset of maturing years. Moreover, with his emergence as the favorite of Florentine elite in the Rucellai Gardens, and even more significantly as a key advisor to and official spokesman for the Medici, Machiavelli began to speak in the 1520s with the voice of the establishment. Neither the Prince nor the Discourses have been a work linked to a specific reform program for Florence. The Prince was written with Giuliano and then Lorenzo de' Medici in mind, not as lords of Florence, but as new rulers of putative principalities in the Papal States on the model of Cesare Borgia. While the latter, the Discourses, was a work not directed to the Medici at all, and not explicitly about Florence, but had as its focus ancient Rome as a standard against which modern politics could be measured. The overall negative political values embodied in these works, as far as modern Italy was concerned, reflected the disillusion that Machiavelli felt about the contemporary political world during his long period in the wilderness, beginning in late 1512, after his dismissal from the Chancery, and his failure to obtain Medici patronage before 1520. The context of the Florentine histories was different. As Florence's official historian, salaried by the Commune and by the University of Florence, Machiavelli now had the ear of Pope Clement VII, and accordingly was writing from the perspective of an actual reformer. In consequence, the Florentine histories have a more visionary quality with regard to political ideals than either the Prince or the Discourses. The work portrays a standard that a republic such as Florence ought to attain, including the full range of Ciceronian, humanist moral and political values.